The light of the golden sap flickered weakly on the living walls of the solar hall, but it offered no warmth. The shadows it cast were long, stretching like cold claws over the colossal roots of Elendor, the kingdom of the seven trees. Arthea stood before the council, her posture tense, though the exhaustion of fire and guilt threatened to consume her entirely. The smell of ash and burnt flesh still clung to her, a sacrilege in the perpetually pure air of the Elven kingdom. The eternal twilight outside seemed to have invaded the hall, as if the sun would never dare to fully rise over a land still bleeding from its own wounded beauty. Only 3 weeks had passed since she had summoned the Fire of Elorion, the sacred power she had sworn to protect, and here she was, summoned to face the judgment of the elves who controlled her destiny. "It is decided," declared King Thandor, his voice resonating with the crystalline coldness of the pure light he so prized. "For the crime of invoking the Fire of Elorion, for burning the sacred ground of Kaer Lyth, and sacrificing thousands of lives to seal the portal." Arthea's hands trembled at her sides. "My king, please. The Devourers, they would have consumed everything. The light, the seven trees. You, does that count for nothing?" "It counts for nothing when what we needed was purity," interrupted Queen Marielle, her thin lips twisted in disdain. "My people trusted you as guardian of the sacred fire, not as its executioner. You failed in your purpose. You failed not once, but thousands of times, one for each life lost in the flames." The members of the Solar Council, Lyriel, Corin, and Silthar, remained silent beside their sovereigns. Their eyes, once reverent when they looked upon the Guardian, now refused to meet hers. They, who represented faith, obedience, and power, now displayed only their corrupted forms: blind faith, servile obedience, and the abuse of power. The shadows were stopped, Arthea argued, desperation beginning to eat at her voice. "The portal is sealed. Elendor survived because of the fire. Elendor is in ruins because of it," Thandor replied coldly. "Kaer Lyth, our bastion, is now a fortress of silent flames and calcified bones. The mages of the Old Order have confirmed. Your profane act has weakened the veil permanently. You did not save the Kingdom Witch. You merely traded one enemy for another, inviting the darkness to nest in our scars." The accusation struck her like a physical blow. The fire ritual had left her exhausted, her soul scarred in ways that would never heal. But she had not known the very fabric of reality had been torn. "That cannot be true," she whispered. "It is true enough for our purposes," said the queen with a dismissive wave. "The council is dissolved. You are stripped of your post. You will be banished from Elendor at dusk." "And the sacred fire?" Arthea's voice failed. A moment of silence hung in the air, heavy with unspoken cruelty. "It no longer exists," said the king finally. "You corrupted it, extinguished it by using it for destruction. You are nothing anymore." Relief flooded her, followed immediately by terror. They weren't just banishing her. They were declaring her soul empty. "Where am I to go?" she asked. "That is no longer our concern." The king rose from his throne of living wood. "You have 1 hour. You will take nothing. Your guardian's robes will be torn. You will be taken to Valdaran, the forest of eternal mist, and there your fate will be given over to the whispers of the dead." As the guards escorted her out of the solar hall, Arthea searched desperately for a friendly face, but found none. Prince Kaelen, the only one who might understand the coexistence of light and darkness, was absent, overseeing the defenses on what remained of the border. His absence was, in itself, a sentence. In less than an hour, Arthea was stripped of her ceremonial robes. The symbol of the sacred fire was torn from her neck. She wore only the burnt rags she had worn when she crawled out of the ruins of Kaer Lyth. The guards seized her, not gently. The doors of the solar hall opened, not to the golden light of Elendor, but to a sickened twilight, choked by the smoke still rising from the distant ruins. The promised rain of ash began to fall as they took her, not along the paths of golden sap, but along the broken edges of the capital, where the destruction was most visible. Surviving elves watched her from the shadows, their faces marked by soot and hatred. She was the guilty one, the witch, the destroyer. No one offered help. The great gates of Elendor, woven from the seven trees themselves, groaned open, revealing the dark forest beyond. Arthea had never left the capital alone, much less under the threat of a world that now saw her as a monster. "Keep walking," ordered the guard captain. "The king's patience is short." With one last look at the kingdom that had been her home, Arthea forced her feet to move into the growing darkness. The gates slammed shut behind her with a finality that sent shivers down her spine. They didn't leave her at the border. They pushed her into Valdaran. The eternal mist enveloped her instantly, cold and damp, clinging to her skin. The trees here were different from Elendor's. Their branches were twisted, and their trunks, pale as bone. She had barely walked for an hour when she heard them. The sound of armor, multiple elves moving quickly through the forest behind her. Pulling herself to the side of the non-existent trail, she listened, fear closing her throat. "She went this way," a voice called out. Arthea recognized it immediately. Captain Voren, the leader of the king's personal guard. She had heard enough gossip in the palace to know his reputation for cruelty in carrying out Thandor's darkest orders. They hadn't just banished her. They had sent men to ensure she never returned. Panic overcame her. Arthea turned from the trail and plunged into the dense forest, dodging low-hanging branches as she buried herself deeper in the wilderness. She heard the trees whispering now, not just with the wind, but with the names of the dead, the thousands she had sent there with her fire. "I hear her!" another voice shouted. Arthea forced her exhausted body to run, but the power of the fire of Elorion had left her empty, drained. She tripped on a moss-covered root. Pain exploded in her ankle as she fell awkwardly. Clawing at the cold mud, Arthea moaned, trying to get up, but the pain was excruciating. The voices grew closer. Desperation propelled her forward until she found a hollow under an ancient fallen tree, a dark, damp hole against the earth. She crawled inside, pressing herself against the rotting wood, and tried to silence her breathing, her heart pounding like a war drum against her ribs. "She's around here." Voren's voice came terribly close now. "Spread out. The king wants confirmation before the mist closes in." Arthea held her breath, silent tears streaming down her ash-stained face. "What do we do when we find her?" one of the men asked. "The king said no traces," came the cold reply. "No loose ends." Frozen in horror, Arthea pressed herself further into the hollow. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as the men searched. Occasionally, the light of an elven crystal illuminated the darkness near her hiding place, and she lay perfectly still, praying the forest of the dead would hide her. Then silence fell. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Even the creatures of the night had fallen quiet. A shadow passed before the entrance of her hiding spot, too tall, too silent to be one of the king's men. Arthea clenched her fists. A pale hand reached into the hollow. Long fingers, not clawed, but with a grace that seemed out of place in this terror. Arthea stifled a scream. "Come," a voice commanded, low and resonant, with an authority that rivaled the king's own. "They will find you if you stay here." "Who are you?" she whispered, the betrayal of her people still fresh in her throat. The figure crouched, and in the faint light of the mist filtering through the trees, Arthea saw a face of severe, tragic beauty, eyes that seemed to hold both the light of stars and the depth of shadows. The heir to the Elven throne, marked by tragedy. Prince Kaelen. "Why?" she whispered again, confusion warring with fear. "You should hate me. I burned your home. I burned Kaer Lyth." Kaelen's eyes appraised her, and for the first time in weeks, she saw no hatred. He did not look at her as an enemy, nor even as a witch. He looked at her as something she herself had forgotten she was. "You come with me?" said the Elven prince to the witch who had set his kingdom ablaze to save it. Arthea's hesitation lasted less than a heartbeat. The touch of Prince Kaelen's hand was not the brutal grip of his father's guards. It was firm, yet strangely reverent. It was the touch of someone who recognized the matter she was made of, not as a traitor, but as a force. She grabbed his forearm, and he pulled her from the damp hollow of the fallen tree with surprising strength, a fluid motion that barely disturbed the mist around them. "They are close," Kaelen whispered, his voice a counterpoint to Voren's cold authority echoing further away. "Do not speak. Do not breathe. Just follow me." He didn't wait for a reply. Wrapping an arm around her waist to support her weight, he guided her into the darkness, his body absorbing the impact of her faltering steps as her injured ankle screamed in protest. They moved through Valdaran like ghosts. Kaelen, the Prince of Light, navigated the forest of eternal mist with an unsettling familiarity, his feet finding no treacherous roots. his shoulders avoiding the low, claw-like branches. Arthea, exhausted and broken, clung to him, her breath suppressed against the leather of his armor. She could feel the tension in his muscles, the readiness of a predator. Behind them, the lights from the guard's elven crystals cut through the mist, faint and sickly. "This way!" Voron's voice rang out, closer than she expected. Kaelen stopped abruptly, pushing her against the pale trunk of an ancient tree. He stood motionless, a sentinel of shadow and light. The whispers of the forest, the names of the dead, grew in intensity in Arthea's ears, a cacophony of accusation. They were the voices of those she had burned at Kaer Lyth. She closed her eyes, a hot tear cutting through the grime on her face. Kaelen placed a finger over her lips, a silent gesture of command. He tilted his head, listening, not to the men, but to the forest itself. Then, as quickly as he had stopped, he pulled her forward again, plunging into a shallow stream whose icy water shocked her senses. They climbed the opposite bank, the mud sucking at their boots, masking their scent and sounds. The voices of Voron and his men faded, swallowed by the mist and the distance. Kaelen didn't slow his pace for hours. He led her out of the boundaries of Valdaran into the ravaged lands that marked the scar between the kingdom and what remained of the bastion of Kaer Lyth. Time lost all meaning. The eternal twilight that hung over the world seemed to deepen, as if the light was being drained from the land itself. Arthea drifted between consciousness and delirium. The cold of the dead forest gave way to an internal fever, the residual heat of the fire of Elorion pulsing under her skin. She saw flashes of the flames, heard the screams of elves and devourers as they were consumed together. Kaelen stopped only once, on a rock outcropping that offered some protection from the wind that now carried the scent of old ash. He laid her down gently, tearing a piece from his own cloak to examine her ankle in the faint light. It was swollen and ugly. With practiced hands, he cleaned it with water from his canteen and bound it tightly. "Why?" Her voice came out hoarse, a scratch in her throat. "Your father, he condemned me." Kaelen didn't look up from his task. "My father condemned himself, Arthea. He just doesn't know it yet." He finished the bandage and offered her the canteen. The water was cool and had the faint metallic taste of a mountain spring. She drank, and the water seemed to quench a small fire within her. "Where are we going?" she asked, dreading the answer. "To the only place where the truth still matters," he replied, lifting her again. "To the place you burned." Terror ran through her, colder than Valdaran's mist. "No, please, Kaelen. Anywhere but there. It is the only place," he insisted, his voice leaving no room for argument. "It is the only place they will not think to look for us, and it is the only place where you can understand." They walked until the ground beneath their feet changed. The soft earth of the forest gave way to rock and dust. The vegetation disappeared, replaced by charred trunks that rose against the sky like the bones of dead gods. They had arrived at Kaer Lyth, the fortress of silent flames. It was a cemetery, a monument to her guilt. The great Elven bastion, built upon colossal roots like Elendor, was now calcified. The towers that once sang with the wind now whistled a mournful tune. The recent rain had turned the ubiquitous ash into a black, sticky mud that coated everything. Arthea stopped at the edge of the ruins, the devastation stretching before her under the sick twilight. The magnitude of her act hit her with full force. "You brought me here to die," she whispered, her legs giving way. "You brought me to see what I did." Kaelen caught her before she fell. "I brought you here to remember," he answered, his voice firm against the moaning wind. "To remember why you did it." He guided her through the ruins. He moved with purpose, as if he knew every broken stone, every fallen beam. Arthea followed him like a sleepwalker, her heart breaking with every step. She saw the remains of elven armor fused to the stone floor. She saw the ghostly outlines of bodies turned to ash by the intensity of the sacred fire. "I am a monster," she wept, the guilt finally breaking her composure. "I am what they said. I burned our people." Kaelen led her to the heart of what had been the citadel, stopping before a great fissure in the stone floor, a black scar that pulsed with residual energy. He forced her to look down. "Thousands," she sobbed, covering her face. "I killed them. They would have died anyway," Kaelen said, his voice soft, yet sharp as glass. "But their death would have been the end of everything, the end of Elendor, the end of the light." Arthea looked up, confusion piercing her grief. What do you mean? I was not in Elendor during your judgment because I was here, Kaelen said, gesturing to the ruins around them. I was in the ashes. I was searching for the truth that my father and the Solar Council refused to see. He knelt, his eyes meeting hers, and she saw the tragedy he carried, the vision of a new world that had marked him. The Council believed the portal the Devourers opened was small. They thought the army we faced was all there was. They were wrong, Arthea. His voice lowered, as if afraid the very stones would hear. The Devourers are not just creatures. They are a hunger, an ancestral hunger that feeds on the very light of the elves, on the golden sap of our trees. The army you saw was just the vanguard. What was behind it? What was coming? It would not have left even ashes behind. But the fire, she began, her mind struggling to understand. The fire of Elorion, Kaelen said, his hand hovering over the dark fissure in the ground. You were the guardian. You knew it is not just a weapon. It is a seal, a power of creation and destruction, a power of finality. The truth began to dawn on Arthea, as terrible and bright as the fire itself. You did not destroy Kaer Lyth to defeat an army, Arthea, Kaelen continued, confirming her deepest fear and her most desperate hope. You set this bastion ablaze to seal the rift. You used the sacred fire to cauterize the wound in reality itself. You sacrificed thousands to save millions. Arthea looked at her hands, the hands that had summoned the flame. The sacrifice, the lives. The fire needed a price, Kaelen said grimly. The ancient power demanded a payment in life to seal the veil. The lives lost here, they were the price. A price you were forced to pay for all of us. The weight of guilt did not disappear, but it shifted. It was no longer the shame of failure, but the excruciating burden of necessity. They call you a witch, Kaelen said, standing, his tall silhouette against the soot-colored sky. They exile you for your crime. But your crime, Arthea, was what bought Elendor's survival. You are not the destroyer of our kingdom. You are its redeemer. Arthea looked at the prince, seeing him truly for the first time. He was not just the heir. He was the only one who understood, the only one who had looked into the abyss and seen what was necessary. Arendor, she whispered, the name of her former mentor, the Archon of the Ashes, sounding like a broken prayer. He warned me. He said the council was blinded by its own light. He was right, Kaelen agreed. And now, they are hunting you, the only one who understands what truly happened. They believe the purity of light must be preserved, even if it means ignoring the shadow growing in their own hearts. Kaelen extended his hand to her again. I brought you to Kaer Lyth because this is not your grave, Arthea. It is your sanctuary, and it is the only place we can begin to fight back. Arthea placed her fire-scarred hand in his. The Elven prince and the Banished witch, alone in the ruins of their sacrifice, as the ashes of an ancient world began to swirl around them, carried on a wind of change. The days that followed in Kaer Lyth dissolved into an endless twilight. Time in the ruins had stopped, trapped in the exact moment the fire of Elorion had consumed stone and life. Kaelen found a refuge for them in the crypts beneath the old bastion, deep chambers the sacred fire had spared, though the heat had vitrified the walls, turning the ancestors' resting place into a tomb of obsidian. The air was heavy with the silence of ashes. Arthea spent the hours in a state of feverish wakefulness, her body struggling to recover from the magical exertion, her spirit haunted by the echoes of the lives she had taken. Kaelen cared for her with a tenderness that contrasted sharply with his warrior prince demeanor. He cleaned her wounds, not just the one on her ankle, but the burns that marked her arms, reminders of the flame she had barely managed to control. He brought water from an underground spring that had survived the cataclysm and shared the travel provisions he carried. They spoke little, but the silence between them was deeper than any conversation. He would sit near her, sharpening his elven blade in the faint light of a crystal, and his calm presence was the only anchor keeping Arthea from drowning in the sea of her guilt. She watched him, the heir of Elendor, sitting in the dust of a burned kingdom, and saw the truth he had shown her. He was not just a prince of light. He was an elf who understood the price of shadows. My father won't stop, Arthea said one night, her hoarse voice breaking the vitreous silence of the crypt. Vorin will be back. He'll bring an army. Kaelen looked up from his blade. The crystal light caught the tragic gleam in his eyes. I know. That's why we cannot stay here. But you needed to regain your strength, and you needed to understand. I understand what I did, she replied, touching the scars on her forearm. But they don't. Thandor and Marielle, the Solar Council, they see the world in pure light or absolute darkness. To them, what I did is unforgivable because it was a mix. It was an impure salvation. Their purity is an illusion, Kaelen said, his voice low and heavy with an ancient anger. It is the arrogance of light that believes it does not need shadow to define its shape. They have become so bright, they have blinded themselves to the hunger growing on our borders. They prefer a pure end to a stained survival. He stood, sheathing the blade. The movement was decisive. While we were in Valdaran, I sent a message. Arthea sat up, alarm coursing through her weary body. To whom? To Elendor? To those who, like me, have learned to see in the twilight, Kaelen answered. Renegade mages the council banished for practicing impure magics, exiled elves who questioned the authority of the Seven Trees. They will find me. You are defying the crown, she whispered, the enormity of his act unfolding before her. He wasn't just protecting her, he was starting a rebellion. I am defying the blindness, he corrected. The Solar Council is already planning your execution. They have sent scouts not only to Valdaran, but to all borders. They don't believe Vorin failed. They believe you used dark sorcery to escape. They need your head to prove that the light has triumphed. He moved closer to her, his presence filling the small crypt. But they are not just looking for you, Arthea. They are looking for me too. My absence has been noted. To them, I am now a traitor, the prince who allied with the witch. The forbidden alliance was sealed, not by oaths, but by necessity. What will we do? She asked, her strength beginning to return, fueled no longer by fire, but by a dark purpose. We will lead them to the truth, Kaelen said. There is a place, older than Elendor, older even than the Seven Trees, a sanctuary where magic is not judged as light or dark, but simply as it is. Mirathin, the sanctuary of the shattered crystal. The name echoed in Arthea's memory, a forbidden place, mentioned only in whispers by the mages of the Old Order. It was said to be where the fragments of the blade of Elorion, the weapon that first shaped light and shadow, were kept. It is dangerous, she said. They say the sanctuary tests those who seek it. It is more dangerous to stay here, Kaelen countered. In Mirathin, there is an artifact, the Orb of Elir. It does not show the future, but the essence of things, the truth behind actions. If there is anything that can prove to our people that the Devourers were real, that your sacrifice was necessary, it is there, and if it cannot, it will show us what our next step must be. They left Kaer Lyth that same night. Leaving the ruins was like emerging from a tomb. The rain of ash had stopped, but the air remained heavy, and the ground was covered in a gray shroud. Kaelen led her along forgotten paths, animal trails, and dry riverbeds that ran along the spine of the world, far from the roads patrolled by Elendor's guards. The journey was arduous. Arthea's ankle still protested, and the power she had used had left her vulnerable, a shell where a sun once burned. But with every step, Kaelen was there. He no longer carried her, but walked beside her, his support a constant presence. They shared the silence, a communion forged in trauma and mutual understanding. She saw the weight he carried, the betrayal of his father, the abandonment of his birthright, all for a conviction that could very well lead them to their deaths. He, in turn, watched her as she looked out at the ravaged world, no longer with the horror of acute guilt, but with the deep sorrow of understanding. She was beginning to accept the burden of her actions, rather than be crushed by it. After days of travel through a landscape that seemed to bleed from its own wounded beauty, they reached the borders of Mirathin. The sanctuary was not a fortress like Kaer Lyth, or a living city like Elendor. It was a hidden valley, shrouded in mists that were not cold like Valdaran's, but warm, like steam from a hot spring. The air vibrated with a palpable energy. In the center of the valley, a structure rose that seemed to have grown from the earth itself, a tower of opaque crystal that looked both broken and whole, reflecting the eternal twilight in 1,000 facets. As they approached, hooded figures emerged from the mist. They were not elves from Elendor. They were the mages of the Old Order, the guardians of Mirathin. "The Prince of Lithorion," one said, his voice like the rustling of dry leaves. and the guardian of the ashes. "We have been expecting you. You knew we were coming?" Kaelen asked, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "The shattered crystal reflects all great disturbances," the mage replied. "And what you did, Arthea of Elendor, was the greatest disturbance in this age." They led them inside the sanctuary. The interior was a labyrinth of refracted light. In the heart of the tower was the Orb of Elir. It was not a perfect sphere, but a large floating crystal stone, milky and full of swirling shadows. "The orb shows the truth," said the elder mage, stopping before it. "But the truth has a price. It demands a sacrifice from the asker, a drop of essence, a memory, a spark of power. We will pay it," Kaelen said. "We need the world to know what she did." "The world will know," the mage said. "But first, you must know." Arthea stepped forward. The orb pulsed in response to her proximity, to the scars of the sacred fire she carried. Kaelen stood beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. Together, they reached out. Arthea placed her fire-scarred palm against the orb's milky surface. Kaelen placed his next to hers. A wave of cold energy coursed through Arthea, drawing something from her. Not pain, but memory. The memory of the fire, the roar of the devourers, the smell of ozone and death. From Kaelen, she felt a wave of sorrow, the vision of his blind kingdom, the pain of turning against his own blood. The orb absorbed it all, and the shadows within began to spin faster, coalescing. The milky surface cleared, and images began to form. They did not see the past. They saw the present. They saw Elendor, where King Thandor and Queen Mariel stood before the 7 trees, now slightly dull, their light weakening. They saw Arendor, the Archon of the Ashes, Arthea's former mentor, standing on the border of the Ash domain, smiling as he looked at the scar she had left in Kaer Lyth, a scar he intended to use. And then, the images gave way to words, burned onto the orb's surface by an internal light. It was not a story, it was a decree, an ancient prophecy, awakened by her sacrifice. The elder mage's voice echoed in the chamber, reading the words aloud as they burned. "The pure light shall become blind. The ancestral shadows will awaken in the scars of the fire. And she who burned the kingdom, she who walked between life and ash, will bring the light that does not blind, but unites." The prophecy hung in the crystal chamber of Mirathin. The words burned into the Orb of Elir, resonating with the finality of a sealed fate. She who burned the kingdom will bring the light that does not blind, but unites. Arthea looked at her hands, the scars from the fire of Elorion pulsing in empathy with the sanctuary's energy. The weight of her sacrifice had not lessened, but its nature had been irrevocably altered. From an act of desperate destruction, it had transformed into the cornerstone of a new age. Kaelen let out a breath, a sigh that carried the weight of his heritage and his betrayal. "The ancestral shadows," he said, his voice low. "The blind light. The prophecy is not a warning, Arthea. It is a description of now." The elder mage, guardian of the orb, nodded, his face a mask of wrinkles beneath his hood. "The fire of Elorion is the power of creation and destruction. By using it to seal the veil against the devourers, you did not just close a door, Guardian. You created a wound in the very weave of reality. A scar in Kaer Lyth," she whispered, the memory of the gray ruins solidifying in her mind. "The devourers fed on light," the mage explained. "These new shadows, the ancestral ones, are different. They do not feed, they undo. They are the echo of the void that existed before the light, and they are drawn not to energy, but to the absence of it. They are drawn to the scar your fire left." The image the orb had shown, her former mentor, Arendor, the Archon of the Ashes, smiling at the devastation, gained a terrible meaning. "Arendor," Arthea said, the name like ash on her tongue. "He knows. He is there." Before Kaelen could answer, an alarm sounded. Not a shrill bell like in Elendor, but a deep, dissonant vibration that seemed to come from the crystal walls of Mirathin itself. The elder mage turned toward the valley entrance. "They have arrived, those you summoned, Prince Kaelen, and they do not come alone." They stepped out of the sanctuary to find the valley, once shrouded in warm mists, now under a biting cold. The mist receded, revealing a group of battle-weary figures at the entrance. There were perhaps 30, an unlikely mix of elves in stained armor that bore no Elendor insignia, and mages whose robes spoke of orders long banished by the Solar Council. They were the renegades, the exiles, the ones who saw in the twilight. "My prince," said an elf woman, her armor scarred by claws that didn't look like they belonged to any known creature. She knelt, not with the blind deference of Elendor, but with the weary respect of a comrade. "We received your message, but we were hunted." "By Thandor's guards?" Kaelen asked, helping her to her feet. "No," the elf replied, her face pale. "Not at first. First, it was the ashes." The terror in the warrior's voice was something Arthea had never heard from an elf. "We hid on the borders of Kaer Lyth, as you instructed. At first, it was just the silence of the dead. But then, the land itself began to change. The ashes, they began to move." "What did you see?" Arthea asked, her voice steady, taking on an authority she didn't know she possessed. The elf woman looked at her, recognizing the guardian of the ashes. "They rise at dusk, my lady. They have no shape. They are just holes in the world. Where they pass, color vanishes. Life withers. Sound dies. They don't kill. They erase." The ancestral shadows had awakened. "Arendor," Kaelen said, the name sounding like a sentence. "Is he there?" "The Archon of the Ashes is in the ruins," confirmed one of the renegade mages, stepping forward. "But he is not fighting the Shadows, Prince. He is weaving them. He uses the residual energy of the Sacred Fire, the scar itself, as a loom. He believes the world has grown stagnant, that Elendor's light is a disease of complacency. He wants to use the void to cleanse the tapestry and begin anew." Arendor's betrayal was cosmic. He did not seek political power. He sought a philosophical apocalypse, a new cycle of destruction. "My father is blind," Kaelen said, his voice vibrating with a cold fury. "He hunts Arthea for a crime of salvation, while his own people are about to be undone by an enemy he refuses to see." He turned to the small group of exiles, to the banished mages, to Arthea. This was their army. "The prophecy said Arthea would bring the light that unites," Kaelen said. "This is that light. Not the pure flame of Elendor, which burns all that is different, but the light of shared purpose, the light that shines in the twilight." He drew his blade. It did not shine with Elendor's golden light, but reflected the sick sky with a steely clarity. "Arendor uses the scar to undo the world. We will use it to seal it again, but not with the sacrifice of thousands. This time, we will fight together." A new war council was formed right there, in the valley of Mirathen. Not in a solar hall of living roots, but among broken stones and ancient magic. The plan was desperate. They could not face the ancestral shadows in open battle. They were entropy made manifest. They had to go to the source. "The fissure," Arthea said, her mind clearing, purpose taking the place of guilt. "The scar in Kaer Lyth. It's a focus. Arendor is using it as an anchor. If we can break his will, perhaps we can close the wound." "He is the Archon of the Ashes," warned the renegade mage. "His wisdom has corrupted into nihilism, but his power is vast. He knows the nature of the sacred fire better than anyone, except you, Guardian. Then I will be the one to face him," Arthea said. "You," she looked at Kaelen and his warriors, "must buy me time. The ancestral shadows are echoes of the void, but he is binding them to this world through the spirits of the dead in Kaer Lyth. The elves I burned." The horror of the revelation silenced everyone. Arendor was not just using the fire's magic. He was using Arthea's guilt as a weapon, desecrating the victims of her sacrifice. "They are his strength and his weakness," Arthea continued, her heart cold as ice. "They are bound to that place by the pain of their death. Kaelen, your elves, they must fight the ash bodies. But the mages, we must bring them peace, free them. Only then will Arendor's anchor break." They marched from Mirathen not as an army, but as a lost cause. Exiled elves and renegade mages, led by a traitor prince and a redeemed witch. The journey back to Kaer Lyth was a descent into hell. The world was dying. The eternal twilight was giving way to an oppressive darkness. The land itself seemed sick, the trees of Valdaran no longer whispering the names of the dead, but groaning in silence. When they reached the edges of the ruins, the devastation was almost unrecognizable. Kaer Lyth was no longer a fortress of silent flames. It was a vortex of cold darkness. In the center, where the great fissure marked the ground, a pillar of anti-light rose to the sky, a beacon of emptiness that sucked the color from the world. The ancestral shadows moved across the landscape, no longer formless, but using the ash and dust to create bodies. They were grotesque effigies of the Elven soldiers who had died there, their eyes empty holes that exhaled cold. And atop the broken citadel, where Arthea had once summoned the fire, stood Arendor. He looked less like an elf, and more like a statue of solidified ash. His arms were open, not in welcome, but in command, his eyes glowing with the dark light of the void itself. "So late, my apprentice," his voice echoed, not through the air, but directly in their minds. "You have come to witness the true rebirth, the end of the tyranny of light." "We came to stop you from destroying everything," Kaelen shouted, raising his blade. Arendor laughed, a sound like cracking stones. "Destruction? No, Prince. This is purification. Creation can only begin from absolute zero." The ash effigies turned toward them. The desperate battle for the soul of the world had begun. "Arthea," Kaelen said, his voice low and urgent, pausing beside her for a moment, the chaos swirling around them. "If we do not survive this, we will," she said, her hand finding his for a brief instant. Her touch was cold, but his was warm, light and ash. "The prophecy," she said, "the light that unites. It is not a metaphor, Kaelen. It is a command." She turned from her prince and walked toward her mentor, toward the heart of the ash storm, ready to face the ghost of her past and the void he had summoned. The air in Kaer Lyth became icy, a vacuum that sucked heat and sound. Kaelen was a whirlwind of steel and twilight, his elven blade cutting through the ash effigies. Beside him, the exiled elves fought with the desperate fury of those with nothing left to lose. But every shadow Kaelen struck down reformed, its empty eyes fixed on him. The renegade mages formed a circle, their voices rising in an ancient chant, an attempt to soothe the tormented spirits Arendor had chained to that place. It was not a battle of strength, but of absolution. While the fight raged below, Arthea climbed the broken citadel. She walked through the ruins of her own power, every step a memory of the fire. Arendor waited for her at the epicenter of the scar, the pillar of anti-light pulsing around him. He was no longer an elf. He was a monument to the void. "You came," his voice echoed in her mind, devoid of warmth. The apprentice returns to her final lesson. "See what your power created, Arthea. Not a seal, but a door, and I am the gatekeeper." "You are desecrating the dead," Arthea shouted, the ash wind whipping her hair. "You are using their pain to undo the world." "Pain is the only truth," Arendor retorted, his void eyes fixed on her. "Elendor's light is a comfortable lie. Your sacred fire was the first spark of honesty this world has seen in ages. I am merely completing your work. We are wiping the canvas clean." The ash shadows advanced on Kaelen. He was forced back, his blade meeting little resistance, but dealing no real damage. "Arthea!" he yelled, seeing her mentor close in on her. "They cannot be destroyed." Arthea looked at the battle below, at the prince who had risked everything for her. She looked at the fissure at her feet, the wound in reality. She understood. The fire of Elorion was a seal, and a seal required a sacrifice. The first time, it had been the lives of the elves in Kaer Lyth. Now, the veil was torn again, and it demanded a higher price. She couldn't fight Arendor, for he was the void. She couldn't defeat the shadows, but she could heal the wound. The orb in Mirathon had said, "She who burned the kingdom, her." She was the key. To seal the veil, the scar didn't need more power, but fulfillment. It needed a spirit. "You are right, Arendor," Arthea said, her voice suddenly calm. "Creation begins from zero, but not from your void, from the ashes." She turned to Kaelen, across the battlefield. Their eyes met. There was no time for goodbyes. In her gaze, she poured all her regret, all her guilt, and all the newfound love for the one who saw her as a redeemer. "Live," she whispered to the wind, and with a final breath, Arthea of Elendor threw herself backward, sacrificing her own spirit into the heart of the fissure, plunging into the pillar of anti-light. For a moment, there was absolute silence. The world held its breath. Arendor let out a laugh, a dry sound like bones breaking as the pillar of shadow imploded, sealing itself with her sacrifice. No! Kaelen's scream was a tear in the fabric of reality, sharper than any blade. The ash effigies stopped, their animator gone, but the wound was sealed, and Arthea was on the other side, lost forever. Kaelen ran to the edge of the now silent fissure. He saw only darkness, but he remembered the legends of the mages of the Old Order. The fissure was not just a scar, it was a cut that reached deep, down to the blood of the earth, the place from which all essence flowed, the silver well. "You will not take her," he snarled, not at Arendor, but at fate itself. He couldn't reach her physically, but the prophecy spoke of union. Kaelen plunged his blade into the calcified stone, closed his eyes, and dived. He did not plunge his body, but his essence. He poured his elven light, pure and ancient, into the darkness of the scar, a desperate beacon seeking the dying ember of her spirit. He found her in the infinite void, a spark of sacred fire about to be extinguished. He reached for her, not with hands, but with his soul. He bound his essence to hers, his light feeding her ashes, his purpose becoming hers. In Kaer Lyth, the exiled elves and renegade mages fell back as the sealed fissure exploded upward, not with shadow, but with a light they had never seen. It was not the pure gold of Elendor, nor the red of Arthea's destruction. It was a bright silver flame, the light of twilight, the light that does not blind, but unites. The wave of energy swept through the ruins. The ash effigies were not destroyed, they were freed. The tormented spirits rose from the dust, finally at peace, and vanished. Where Arendor had stood, nothing remained, not even ash. The pillar of anti-light was gone, replaced by a soft glow. Kaelen opened his eyes. The pain was excruciating, as if he had been remade from the inside out. He knelt, pulling Arthea's physical, motionless body from the edge of the now dormant fissure. She was cold. He placed his hand over her heart and pushed the new silver flame that now burned in his own spirit into hers. Arthea gasped, her eyes flying open. They were no longer just hers. In them, Kaelen saw the reflection of his own light. And in his own eyes, she saw the glow of her fire. The exiled elves and renegade mages watched in wonder as Kaelen stood, his once fair hair now streaked with ash, his eyes glowing with the silver flame. He was something new, the first flame elf. He lifted Arthea, who was alive, her spirit now bound to his. Their union marked the end of the age of separation. In that moment, Arthea, the banished witch, the guardian of the ashes, found her place not as an outcast, but as half of a new beginning. The prince and the witch had rewritten fate. The battle for the soul of Kaer Lyth was won. The ancestral shadows were banished, the veil sealed, but the war against the blind light of Elendor, against the arrogance of King Thandor, and the complacency of a world that preferred purity to truth, that war was just beginning. And in the heart of Elendor, the 7 trees trembled, and their golden sap flowed a little slower, as if they sensed the birth of a power they could not control. Want to see more stories like this? Then subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos.